Okay, welcome everyone. We have a very special program today. My name is Segal. I'm the chief curator of the Wende Museum. I'm very honored to be joined today by Melissa Chen and Badiucao. Please give them an applause. Yeah. It's wonderful for a book presentation to see so many people show up. That can have different reasons. Maybe you all love the Wende Museum, or maybe you're all familiar with the work of Melissa and Badiucao and want to experience them live. But I think a third option is that they are bringing a topic that is very relevant nowadays and that is bothering us all. And I think there is a need to come together and to discuss things in a fundamentally changing world right now. A little bit for those of you who have never been to the museum. About the museum, it's a collection of Cold War era art and artifacts from the socialist countries worldwide. We use this collection as a starting point for our exhibitions and programs to try to make meaningful connections between the past and the present, including the visions of contemporary artists on those topics. And sometimes it happens that you organize an exhibition like we did with our current exhibition, which is about surveillance and counter-surveillance, knowing that it is a relevant topic, but not realizing that when you open the exhibition, it has become more relevant than ever before. So that's the world we're living in right now. If you have a chance to check out the exhibition, it has two components. One component is a historical one that shows that surveillance and facial recognition technology have a history, and that knowing that history actually informs you to know what we are dealing with nowadays. The other part is the counter-surveillance part, which consists of 16 art projects that critically reflect on the current state of surveillance and facial recognition in different ways, by showing how to evade surveillance, how to criticize it, also how to reappropriate it and use it as a tool of liberation. Today, it turns out that the topic of surveillance is very relevant for our discussion today. We are going to talk about a graphic novel that deals with repressive regimes, with totalitarian regimes, with dictatorships, and both our speakers have a lot of experience with that. You see the cover here of You Must Take Part in Revolution. I read it and I hope you are going to read it as well. It's disturbing, it's thought-provoking, it's enlightening, it's written with a literary flair, and it has illustrations, images that are absolutely masterful and striking. I will start with introducing both speakers, and then I will moderate a discussion which will have three components: a little bit about both your personal backgrounds and trajectories. Of course, we are going to talk about the book, and then we are going to talk about the current political situation and how that is reflected in the book and also beyond that. But let me first officially introduce the two of you. Melissa Chen is an Emmy Award-nominated Hong Kong and Taiwanese American foreign correspondent based between Los Angeles and Berlin. She was previously posted in China until she became the first journalist in more than a decade to be expelled by the Chinese authorities in 2012. Much of her reporting examines human rights, the rise of global authoritarianism, and the defense of democracies. Her work has taken her from Pyongyang to Moscow to Havana, and she has written for, among others, the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time Magazine, and The Guardian. As a broadcast correspondent, she has reported for Vice News Tonight, and Al Jazeera. And this is her debut graphic novel. Then Badiucao is a Chinese-Australian artist, activist, and political provocateur. One of the most popular and prolific creatives from China, he confronts a variety of social and political issues in his work, often using satire to tackle censorship, authoritarianism, and capitalism. He has exhibited in the United States, in Australia, and throughout Europe. He has been interviewed by the Washington Post, The Guardian, Time, CNN, NBC, and CBS News' 60 Minutes. In 2020, Badiucao won the Human Rights Foundation's Václav Havel International Prize for Creative Dissent. He currently lives in exile in Australia, and also this is his debut graphic novel. So, yeah, I'm going to move over this side. Yeah. And by way of introduction, I would like to ask the two of you, starting with Melissa, to tell a little bit about yourself, your trajectory, and what led you to your collaboration and to writing this novel.
Yeah, so I've mostly only been a journalist my entire adult working career, and I can talk a lot about it, but I think what I'll do is actually show you a video just to provide some context. This was from more than a decade ago. This is in Beijing, and the person you're going to see is someone who's being held against their will. So here we go.
I asked them a very simple question. What are they doing inside? You can hear this woman screaming. She just said, "You're here to save me. You're here to save me. I'm trying to get out." Now she's been kept quiet. There are 3 men that answer the door. You can hear her. She's trying to get out. We've definitely found a black jail here.
That door never opened again. We don't know what happened to the woman.
So I was in China for about 6 years, and most of it was with Al Jazeera English. And I guess you know, Al Jazeera English has the ethos of trying to represent the view from the global south. So I went in really wanting to cover China in a way that was different from the so-called West. What ended up happening, though, is a sort of journey in terms of understanding human rights, dignity, and justice, and understanding that those are universal values. And that has kind of become the framework in which most of my reporting has been done since then and over the years. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you can speak to Chinese farmers and they'll say, "I want to be treated fairly." They might not say, "I want human rights," but actually the intention is the same. And that kind of drove my reporting in China and then in other places after. So this is, for example, me covering a natural disaster. And as you know, as Jos mentioned, I've reported from Pyongyang, from Havana, and I think you'll see a pattern here of reporting from authoritarian countries. That was kind of by accident. It just kind of happened. But then I think to round it out in terms of answering your question about working on this book, I felt after 20 years of writing articles, long-form pieces, doing video format work, doing breaking news, 24/7 sort of live television as well, that there were limitations to that format and a little bit of a frustration as I was reflecting on my career and how I could sort of take the things that I've saw as a journalist and push it further and reach out to new audiences, because sometimes you feel like it's the same group of people who are high news content consumers watching Al Jazeera or reading the New York Times, and how can you actually sort of push these ideas and concepts to younger generations who are just staring at their smartphones and just flipping and looking at things from a purely consumerist basis.
Okay. Thank you very much. Badiucao, for you the same question. Can you tell us a little bit about the path towards this graphic novel?
So I am born in China, and I'm actually born in a very artistic family. My great-parents, my grandpa and his brother, were actually the first group of filmmakers, been very active from 1930 until 1950. When China's Communist Party is in power, then they get into trouble because the film that they make, and the film was categorized as poison grass by the time. And as you can imagine, during a political purge campaign called 100 Blossom, or anti-intellectual movement, My grandpa was sentenced to a rural village in the far west of China. He eventually died there because of sickness, and his brother killed himself on one of the film sets. So I grew up in such family that this fear that being an artist is very dangerous. In China, having artistic expression is very dangerous in China. Is always something follows me to a point that my parents wouldn't support me to be an artist. And the only way that I can finally control my life or fulfill my potential or my desire to follow up the steps of my great parents as artists is leave. So I left China in 2009 and thinking about reinventing myself in this new country where I am thousands miles away from the Chinese government. So I should be free and safe to, fulfill my dream, to be an artist. But the reality is much harsher than that, because when I learned the news that artists in China who are outspoken ones are being persecuted just because their practice, even after decades away from my great parents' tragedy, that I know I have to do it anonymously, which means I do not show my real face in any public speech like this or public performance. Badiucao is not my real name, but an artist name. And I successfully hide my identity for 7 years while creating a lot of political satire and artworks that targeting China's human rights record. However, in 2018, just several days before my first Hong Kong solo exhibition, my identity got compromised. And then my family member back in China got dragged to the police station and going through terrible interrogations for things that they have zero idea, because I've kept my art practice very far away from my family or friends. But they were the ones who suffer for me. Thus, a very hard decision have to be made. Basically, the Chinese police said, if you don't give up your art, if you don't shut down the Hong Kong exhibition, there will be no mercy to you nor to your family. That's the quote from them. But for me, I always know that this moment will come, and this choice is something that I have to make. And I always believe that you cannot change or exchange your freedom for safety, because if you do so, you may just lose both. And once you're on the target list from authoritarian government, don't expect they will forgive you or forget about you. They're just waiting for a right moment, perhaps the quiet moment that snap you. And the only way to continue to fighting this cause is keep speaking up. So I decided to show my face after that incident and continuing making art that I always believing in. But the situation is not getting better, because now they're more like targeting me directly through all form of transnational repression, from being followed in Australia, harassment to the people who I work with, to sabotage my exhibition all over the world. That the Chinese government, the consulate or embassy would call museum or gallery who dare to show my work directly and saying this is anti-China or this is hurting the Chinese feeling. And it will damage the diplomat relationship between those countries and China. For example, like in Italy, in Czech Republic, and my recent exhibition is in Poland. All of that is harassed and basically blackmailed by the Chinese government. But it doesn't mean I stop making art. I want to make my art more relevant and strong. So on the screen, you can see some of the screenshots from my exhibition. And for this work particularly, it is addressing the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, when brave Chinese people took the streets and protest. And there are 3 art school students who have the courage to throwing eggs filled with color, paint, to Mao Zedong's portrait in Tiananmen Square. And immediately they got arrested and disappeared in the crowd. And this performance art is me trying to finish the job that they couldn't back in the years. So yeah, this is very much my life till today, that I have to look on my shoulder all the time. But I also believe that, you always need something happen that giving people hope and inspiration. And only for doing that, you will get more support. whether from your own community or internationally, like what we have here in America. However, I do feel for this trip to be in America, the time is more ambiguous. But then, we will explore this topic further later, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's incredible that you started writing this novel 4 years ago, and here we are almost living the novel. But let me first ask you to, first of all, maybe briefly summarize the main storyline of the novel so that we know what we are talking about without giving away too much. And I also want to add another question to it.
Sorry, so we got the timing of the slides a little wrong, and I didn't actually go through these. We haven't gone through these, but yes, these are more recent and shows a different side of Badiucao's art, so you can see the diversity, if I can speak on your behalf. Sure. But it seems like people like it, so there's that.
Okay. So yeah, coming back to the novel, maybe you can say a little bit about it as far as you want to tell us about it. But I also want to ask you, this is the first time I think that you have been working with a visual artist, and it's the first time for you that you have been working with a writer. Can you tell us a little bit about how that partnership worked? Were you inspired by his images? Were you inspired by her text? Did both of that happen? What was the process?
So this was pandemic lockdown time, and I joke that this was my sourdough bread or my knitting. I was at home looking at my childhood shelf of graphic novels, things like MAUS, Persepolis, V for Vendetta, Watchmen, and also on social media, on Twitter, back in the pre-Elon Musk days, following Badiucao, who I had actually interviewed I think about 6 months or a year before the pandemic. He was in Berlin at one point for about a year working for Ai Weiwei at his studio there. And I am mostly based in Berlin, and I noticed that there had been a lot of Chinese creatives, whether filmmakers or artists that I was just starting to meet. And it really reminded me of Americans or other people in Paris in the 1930s or in Berlin in the 1930s, where they felt that their home, in whatever context, for whatever reason, was not the right place to be in order to pursue their art. And in the Chinese context, of course, this was it was getting more and more closed. We've seen what's happened in the last 10 years, last 15 years. The environment in China has just become more authoritarian, and I would argue you can say that it's actually quite fascist. And so if you were someone who wanted to be creative and Chinese and you wanted a long career, China was not looking so great, and a lot of them were going to Berlin. So that's how we met. In a professional sort of interview, and so I was following him on social media, and I was just wondering, there was so much there, and I just one day just slid into his DMs like one would, and just went have you thought of sequential art? And that's really how it kind of started. And some good friends here as well today, I rang up and asked about comics, and they made suggestions about what to read and just to get going and maybe do a Kickstarter. So it was really kind of a small thing in the beginning of 24-page comic, let's do a Kickstarter. And 4.5 years later, I don't know what happened. It just sort of it snowballed and snowballed. And at one point I do remember we had a call where I was like, let's go big or go home. I mean, I really did say that. And that's kind of what happened. But we were new to publishing, we were new to comics, and I think one of the big lessons for me, and what's really important, and it relates to my journalism work, is after 20 years doing anything, you kind of become a little bit complacent, no matter what. And doing this, I think if I'd known what the publishing industry was like, I would not have done this. The odds were so against us, getting an agent, getting a publisher, the whole, just getting books sold. And because I didn't know what to fear, we did it. And I think it was such a great reminder that, life after the book will have to happen, and I will continue and have been continuing to do journalism work. And it's such a great reminder of I have to go back out there to do the reporting, and I know too much about what can go wrong, and I just have to have no fear and sort of recapture that zeitgeist.
Well, for me, I mean, I always want to try sequential art, partially because my family history, that to have filmmakers, grandparents, that I want to do something more than just single frame cartooning or performance art or installation in the museum. I want to do something engage with the narrative, with the time as material. So when Melissa was pitching this idea, I was like, oh, fantastic, let's do it. But also to a more broad level, or, you know, during the COVID, it's not just sourdough, I would say, but it's also perhaps ending the protests in Hong Kong due to this thing. And a lot of people are suffering from extreme zero COVID policy in China. So there is a lot of tensions building in China and around those regions. And I feel like I must have something to say, but in a form that must have to be more profound and thought take and time costing. So this project really arrived in time to fulfill my desire to express in a longer form, perhaps in a more deep thinking form. But of course, the process is not that easy because it's absolutely new to me. And also, we don't want to treat this graphic novel as some kind of tour to tell background context, politics in China. We really want to treat this graphic novel as a novel itself. We want to create characters not as tour, you know, speaking for us, but creating something more real than that, to touch people from different backgrounds, to touch people who may not necessarily paying a lot of attention to human rights issues, but also have a chance to understand the struggle with us, but not throwing those knowledges, geopolitical knowledges, but more like emotional humanity level. And that becomes the biggest difficulty for creating those characters in the story. But I also think this is the most rewarding experience.
Thank you. So in the novel there are, and I noticed that you are not saying too much about the content, which is totally fine. In the novel, a few philosophical issues are brought up, and I want to discuss a few of them with you. One is the use of violence in protest. There's a whole discussion in the novel whether violence is necessary to get anything changed, or whether it is imitating the tools of the enemy, of the suppressive state, and always morally repugnant. Can you give us a little insight in your internal discussions about revolution and violence?
I'll start as a journalist, having covered a lot of protests, and I think part of what this graphic novel was for me, and I think what's interesting when you have two creators is it means fundamentally different things, possibly, and we also probably might have different intentions, and that makes it very interesting. But I've seen protest movements such as that in Hong Kong, such as that of the students and young people in Myanmar. We saw it also in Thailand. And just sort of reflecting on people who take to the streets, I do feel like 21st century protests are not doing what they were able to do in the 20th century, and that has to do with the fact that 21st century authoritarian countries have learned the lessons of 20th century authoritarianism. And that also raises the question of nonviolent resistance and whether there are limits to that. I think that the success of nonviolent resistance movements in the 20th century has carried over in terms of how things should be conducted in the 21st century. And certainly from a journalist standpoint, in terms of morality, you never want to hurt anyone, no matter, you know, what side they're on, even if they are the oppressor, right? But looking at it sort of in terms of just sheer numbers, in terms of the number of protests in different countries, the political scientists have looked into this, and they're just not getting as much traction as they used to. Added to the fact of the technology aspect of things and the ability for governments to surveil us, whether it's in the United States or in authoritarian states. And I think that the odds are kind of stacked more against citizens than ever before. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think part of why I worked on this was also trying to work through this nonviolent versus violent resistance theme, which has kind of age old. It's been something discussed generation after generation. And I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that the autocrats have learned the lessons of the past. And I think they're better at maintaining power than in the past.
To me, I think this is always a big question within any dissident community, that what is the most useful or efficient way to actually having a meaningful change? Especially, imagine you've been repressed for decades with your nonviolent movement. What if it doesn't work? Do we really have an option? And those are the questions that we try to dive deep into the story, but we're not having the intention to just give an easy answer, to say this is right, that is wrong. I guess what we really try to express is, even in the most desperate situation, there's always individual choices, and those individual choices are not just disappear or powerless. It actually can create a lot of consequence, and consequence that you might like and don't, particularly in the movement which turn into more violent. We don't want to judge easily, say, you know, this is wrong to do the violent, but for people who choose that path, that we want people to understand that there is a clear consequence, whether it's in the society or even it's just inside struggle, because when you terminate physically your enemy, you're also losing a part of your own humanity. But also we have to understand the context. We have to know that how much struggle people go through to a point that they're willing to sacrifice their own humanity just to spark a change. These things are hard questions. We weren't really providing answers. But I think giving the context now globally, that the rise of violence, whether it's through war or social movement, people should not go easily to any option like this, but have a profound think.
Thank you. Melissa, you mentioned the role of technology in repressive governments, and of course that also links to our surveillance exhibition. I would like to ask both of you if you think that technology is always predominantly used by oppressors, or can it also be a liberating tool for people to regain their agency or organize themselves?
Well, for me, as an artist, always trying to infiltrate China's online internet. Without social media, in the early time, it will be almost impossible. That there are still a lot of people inside of China using VPNs to going around the Great Firewall, which is the online censorship system. So without those weapons from the modern technology, it wouldn't be possible. But on the other hand, we know those big machines are in control of authoritarian government. So the methodology is we have to keep gaming up. Like now, well, AI is probably one of the most hot topics. And imagine AI will be applied as a form of censorship. And actually, this very book has experienced some kind of censorship from the latest developed Chinese AI machine, that Deep Search. Because we try to ask...
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek, yes. We try to ask a review on the book. And what happened is it actually gives some answer and even introduction to us for the authors.
Pretty nice what it's saying.
But after 1 second, just something happened and the answer got deleted. And instead, it asked us, like, let's talk something else. So that's how AI can play both sides. But on the other hand, I will not, back from adapting the power of those new technology. Actually, through the process of creating this graphic novel, I did use AI as referencing making to accelerate the efficiency of the book. So I guess it's a never-ending competition that artists or activists or dissidents should not be shied away from learning those new technology, but actively embrace it and use it as a weapon to fight back.
And I just want to add that because DeepSeek AI was starting to, the Chinese AI chatbot had censored our book and censored us and censored a few other artists, including, once again, Ai Weiwei, a couple of media organizations reached out to us. So it's almost like the Streisand effect, right? Like, that's something with authoritarian countries they just don't seem to get. Like, if that the harder you sort of suppress something, the more it's going to be news. I don't know, just worth pointing out, but it helped get us attention.
Thank you. So you both in your own way have a lot of experience, first-hand experience with repressive regimes. How would you interpret the global rise of right-wing populism, right-wing extremism we see everywhere now? And do you think that democracies have a perspective, a future perspective, or is that something of the past?
I think it's really hard. If you look at human history, all of it, most of it, has been in terms of systems of kings and emperors. And democracies in general has been a little blip on the timeline. So if I was a betting person, I wouldn't bet in favor of democracy, unfortunately. It's just not the trend of human civilization. And that depresses me. I do think that it's really, and I say this, gosh, I don't know how I'm gonna get myself in trouble. I think
that's why we are here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nature of democracies and the nature of my own work as a journalist is that you have to hold governments to account. And we do that pretty well in democracies. And I guess part of me is looking at what's happening over the last 3 or 4 weeks and wondering whether, not journalists should never be cheerleaders, but like whether there were other sectors of society that should have been pushing for people in democracies to remind them to be proud of being in a democracy and really that it has to be fought for generation after generation. I think we've kind of lost that a little bit. And that has allowed authoritarians and people with autocratic tendencies to create a little bit of a wedge. And I am of the 9/11 generation. I was a senior when 9/11 happened. And so my entire adult career as an American has also been seeing all these decisions that the United States has made. And the story continues, unfortunately, but it's all kind of felt like it's downhill. And I know that's a little reductionist because obviously in the 90s, the end of history, when things were supposedly good, there were also wars and conflicts all over the world that didn't impact us. But I guess I'm rambling, but I don't know. And I do think that it's a big challenge and it's really scary. And I feel afraid, and I think it's okay to feel afraid and still move forward and try to figure out how we each in different ways can fight back. And I don't think everyone can to do the reporting that I did. I don't even know how I did that. But you know, you just have to, everybody's personality is different and you have to just fight in the way that works for you. I've interviewed a lot of dissidents and people who are now serving life sentences in China. And you know, they are a very different type of person than me. I can't do what they do. I have been detained by Chinese police, and I'll freely admit it was like I was pulled off Tiananmen Square my last year as a reporter there, and it was a really scary experience. And I think at some point after like 3 or 4 hours there, they handed me a piece of paper and said, "Please sign this," and I was like, okay. Like, you know, maybe I should feel shameful, but I don't think so. This is my limit, and I'll sign whatever. And if you free me, I'll denounce everything that was in that piece of document, right? Like, that's how I work. But there are others who are like Navalny, who will be, you know, in prison for 10 years, and he'll never sign the damn paper. And, you know, I don't think one is better than the other. We each have to find our way and fight back.
Thank you.
Well, like I said earlier, that it's a weird time to be in America, especially from a perspective of Chinese dissident artists, because we used to look up to democracy in the West, particularly in America, that we call American lighthouse, because we believe this is one of the most powerful democracy that's setting a model for the rest of the world. And all we're fighting to change China is one day to make it a democratic country like America or other democratic Western country. But the situation is very, very different now that, it's not, I think it's, for me, it's not just about people are worried about the destiny of the nation here, but with a global perspective, the failing on America's democracy is making the rest of the world losing faith in democracy and human rights, those very important values, fundamentally. And then where do we go? We don't know. And that's very important. So defending the democracy in America is much larger than just about this country. Certainly, it's not just America first. And, you have a very powerful country. That it comes from responsibility and also interest as well. And foreseeing what's happening between Trump, Zelensky in that meeting, it's horrifying, because imagine what message it is sending to China when it eventually have decided to invade Taiwan. It's as if there's no consequence. And with the current trajectory, perhaps as artists, I can give more wild guess than you, Melissa, as journalist. But what I am seeing is perhaps three empires, like America, Russia, and China, is going to divide the cake of the earth. And where does democracy go? It's no longer going to be a mainstream narrative. The authoritarian regime will be normalized after this. But I do believe that in America, you still have democracy and a very strong civil society. Like here, that everyone coming here in the Wende Museum. So defending the democracy in the next 4 years and do not lose it to Trump, do not fulfill his lies that he's in fully control is very important, and not just to this country, but perhaps the entire humanity.
Yeah, that's a very powerful statement. We are almost moving to the Q&A. I want to finish with one last question, and it is there are a lot of initiatives nowadays with titles like Bridging the Gap, including, by the way, our own student council, which we share with the Thomas Mann House, trying to find ways to keep the communication open. Do you think that is still a realistic perspective, or are there differences between people who talk about facts and others who talk about alternative facts, that it is too late to have a conversation?
Gotta be your answer.
I don't quite know what you mean by the question, but if you mean that whether it's time to be like Captain Von Trapp and punch Nazis, I do wonder. I mean, there are people I know who support and voted for this current administration and seem rather quiet about what's happening in terms of the destruction of the government. And we were talking earlier about the similarities of what Doge is doing and Elon Musk to the Red Guards of the Cultural Revolution. And I'll add that an analogy does not have to be perfect to be useful. And we're not the only ones. If you look up the New York Times, Yuan Li, a reporter I greatly admire, has recently written in the last 48 hours a piece about how many people in the Chinese diaspora is looking at these teens who feel, these tech teens, these tech guards, I call it, who are breaking things and destroying things and believing that they know better than the adults. And there is a similarity because they have a cult leader. And I've also made the comment that in some ways, perhaps Elon Musk is the Jiangqing. Given the power bestowed on him from Mao Zedong or the leader that we have now. And the similarities, of course, of President Trump speaking as if he is America, l'état c'est moi, in the same way that we've seen other leaders in North Korea and China speak. And so when things are like that, I think it's really hard as a journalist, though, because you don't want to, and Jon Stewart said this, I think, about a week ago or two, about like he doesn't want to you don't want to get ahead of your skis. You don't want to say things are fascist when they're really not. And I have seen this, right? Like, I reported in China, and then I went back to America, and there'd be protesters screaming about how America is fascist. And I was like, I get how you're feeling, but in my head I was like, you have no idea. Like, you get to go to court, the defense lawyer is in the courthouse with you. Can I tell you that in China, if you're a human rights activist being charged, your lawyer doesn't get into court. There's no one there representing you. So when we use these words like authoritarian and fascist, there is a certain responsibility about not getting ahead of our skis. But we're also, I think the last few weeks have been a great accelerant in terms of how quickly things can happen. And so, yes, I don't know what I will do in terms of engaging with people that you feel like are perhaps lost in their sort of milieu of disinformation, and whether it's time to punch Nazis. I'm not a puncher, but it's certainly something that goes back to the themes of the book of nonviolent versus violent resistance. I don't have the answers, but let's just say that I stew in it and worry about it a lot.
Yeah, I think Melissa is just giving a perfect answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We are moving to the Q&A now, and I'm going to stand up to see where the questions come. My colleague Kate will walk around with a mic. And I see one first question here on the front row.
Thank you. Great, huge admiration. One of the most Orwellian strange things I keep running into with my progressive and even anarchist friends is they're decrying the death of the FBI and the CIA, which I'm thinking, no, we hate those guys. Why are you sad that the FBI and the CIA are going away? And I was wondering if you have a response to that as a part of the government that is the surveillance state being, a revolution eating its own.
I think that any organization has good people and bad people, and the same goes for the FBI and CIA. I think. Well, I mean, it is. I mean, with intelligence, especially because as a foreign correspondent, I've sort of touched on that a little bit, and I guess I don't quite know how to answer the question, except that as a journalist, every institution and organization should be held accountable. There's certainly been lots of things that the FBI and the CIA has done that's been deeply problematic. And then there are also a lot of things they've done for the interests of not just US national security, but international security that is good. And it depends on the officer, it depends on the team, it depends on the mission. So that's the best way to answer it in such a short amount of time. But as a journalist, I would say that I've certainly seen both.
There's a question over here. Yeah.
Hi. So in terms of just the, I guess the development of everything happening with the current administration, it's in terms of just the sort of dissolution of the bureaucracy that exists in the central government, and just how, as you mentioned, the the tech cards with the little Doge, little Groiper teeny boppers. And just how sort of, going past the sort of processes of what would normally be, going through the courts, going through Congress, and just kind of taking your own agenda and just, actioning it, right? In terms of the defense of democracy, I'm kind of thinking back to the State of the Union with a lot of I guess, the opposition members in the Democratic Party just wearing pink jackets and with little ping pong paddles with little cute messages. In terms of actively defending democracy, and on top of that, I mean, Hakeem Jeffries, going to Silicon Valley, and I mean, even talking about the censure of the representative with Al Green, with the cane and everything, with 10 Democratic members looking to censure that person. In terms of looking outwards beyond the bipartisan party system, how do individual Americans, what would they need to do in order to more actively defend democracy? Because it just seems as if the sort of machinations in the larger, Democratic Party and in the opposition just don't seem to be working. It seems to be more of like, let's have decorum. Let's work within the margins of the path of like the precedent.
Right.
So how can the democracies be more effective, basically?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
You know how kind of pathetic you have to ask someone from China how to solve the problem in America. But I do want to say that I think for the first couple of weeks for Trump's presidency, the methodology that he is using is really bombing with all weird and crazy policies, that as if he's creating a delusion that he's in total control, and there's nothing you can do because you do not have the time to respond to it. So my suggestion will be firstly, do not believing that he's in total power. Believe the power that within your own institution and civil rights. And you mentioned due process. I think due process is one of the foundation for any democracy. So take your time, go through every problem and defend it and defeat it and debate it all the way that you can. But also very importantly that, demonstration in the street in a non-violent way, then you all go together. You will have a stronger sense of community that saying that, okay, we're not alone. We're not totally, drowned by Trump's nonsense yet. And that's very important, in a spiritual and mental level. These are all the rights that still within your power, within the system of law. Then if you don't practice it gradually, it will be eaten away by, continue coming with Trump's crazy movement or lies. So I do think there are a lot to do that I do not know about your society and law system better than you. You would know much better than me, and you will find a way to do it. But do it.
I would just add that as a journalist, I was just in the Baltics in December, actually on assignment in Lithuania, Estonia, looking at potential Russian incursions and how the Baltics were going to prepare for that. I can say that the panic messages I've gotten from the Lithuanians I interviewed in December now is very, it's quite a moment. But there is something shocking about what's happening or what's not happening among Americans, because the Lithuanian text is sort of like, why aren't you guys out on the street? I was in Georgia, not the state, but the country. And so the Georgians were also writing me saying, why aren't you? We were out on the street. If you follow news, Georgia was out in the Georgians were out in the streets for weeks last year. And I can go on, but my international network of people in various countries that have fought and protested, people who've worked on building democracies, are utterly shocked at the relative quiet in which this is all happening. People, our good friends in the Czech Republic, saying the same thing. They're astounded, and I don't know the answers to that, but I think whatever has to happen soon.
Is there a question over there? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this book, Melissa. Hi. One of the frustrations I think a lot of people who are trying to fight for democracy in the country here is that nearly half, we don't know really, we're just basing on voting, not only voted for this administration, but seem to be either quietly or loudly applauding a lot of what's going on. So I'm wondering, in other authoritarian regimes that you've been to and that you've studied, to what extent did the population, a certain segment of the population, really drink the Kool-Aid of that administration, of that regime, and in what ways was that dynamic helpful or hurtful to that regime sort of taking hold or democracy eventually winning out? I'm just wondering what you've seen in terms of the population itself really buying into this sort of dismantling of democracy and what that meant.
I think I can give some example from China. I do not believe the government has total control of how people think in China, even though giving all the powerful propaganda and censorship. But what it's really trying to do, if we go through the event of the Tiananmen massacre, the after effect of it is it really make people fear about they were losing life on the street. But on the other hand, they open the door for the economic reason and telling the people that stop pursuing political reform or change, just settling to make money, to have your egg price reduced, then it'll be fine. And to a point that you would believe, okay, all the Chinese people have been trained to forget about those basic rights and become zombie, only pursuing personal well-being or get rich. But then, for the current generation, when the memory of Tiananmen massacre has faded out because of censorship, and when the China's zero COVID policy kicking in and creating all the miserable families suffering in China again, then what we see is the protest, which is called white paper protest, that massively nationwide, almost like the wave from the Tiananmen Square movement, that actually successfully changed the policy on the COVID control in China. So I think it's all about a narrative, a delusion that the authority want to create to make you to believe that you lose your power as an individual, that you have to obey it because whatever you do will be meaningless. And I guess what we can do, just denying this delusion and talking to people, make new organization and network within the people that can still listen or share your value.
Yeah, you're on the second row.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and for this incredible work. I'm so interested that this graphic novel draws upon journalism and also performance art and political art, and just knowing that it took 4 years and what you felt about the medium opened up possibilities to imagine a more dystopian future or a more hopeful future in a different way than your reporting or art practices did, and how you toggle between very almost more reactive forms of storytelling versus this kind of longer investment of time.
Well, first of all, I'll just say that 4.5 years sounds like a long time, but there are people sitting in this room who've worked on projects of graphic novels for much longer. So it tells you just how much work it takes to produce any one of these works. I think for me, doing this has been, I don't want to say therapy, but it's helped me sort of work through ideas. I don't really have the answers to things. I'm sure you guys have figured that out. Gosh, I don't know. It's such a hard question. Do you have?
For me, I think sometimes topic about human rights and politics can be so heavy that to a point it becomes less popular, because who you can tell are very limited, the people who dedicate to those topics. But I always imagine, again, in 1989, the tank man who stood in the front of tank. He's not any less than Superman and Spider-Man. Why don't we have something as cool as that? That not just about the story, but also the present, also engage with the pop culture. That giving it a possibility, maybe this book can be developed into a film, Netflix theory, or video games. So that was one of the dreams that I would have behind this project, and that is why I'm willing to devote so much time on this project. It's a trying. I don't think there are a lot of political artists are actively engaged with pop culture or entertainment industry, and thus it actually make it very relevant and cool to have the talk in LA itself, because the film industry here or entertainment industry here.
Yeah, I think you have to meet people where they are, and I think as a journalist, going back to something I said earlier, you know, you write an article or you do something for television, but younger people are not reading them, and they're not even able to watch something longer than 10 minutes, right? So one thing for me was the sort of the visual aspect of this. These are sort of portrait panels, right, on a page that kind of resemble a smartphone. And the visual language of moving through it is kind of like, I mean, it's paper, but it's closer to a smartphone than me standing in front of the camera doing my broadcast correspondent work that I've done. So I think that there is and I think it goes back to some of what the gentleman said about democratic opposition, like putting up signs or wearing the clothes of a certain color. Yeah, that's good and important, but I think there is a failure from the absent opposition right now in terms of meeting people where they are. As I'm an advocate of, I mean, the human rights there's been a lot of human rights organizations that's been impacted by the cut in federal funding over the past 3 weeks. People would say the entire ecosystem globally has been impacted directly or indirectly. And you know, I know a lot of them, and I'm listening to them trying to rally, and they're like, oh, I'm putting out a press release. Oh, the Wall Street Journal is going to interview us about this. And I just wanted to scream at them and say, Doge does not read the Wall Street Journal. You gotta go and talk to the YouTubers. And these are human rights people who have graduated with good degrees and are working on important things, and that's just not their world, but we have to go to that world. And I feel like it's scary and distasteful, and I know even like the governor of California, didn't he just invite somebody recently, like just like the last... Yeah, and I don't know how I feel about that, and we should discuss it, but we should discuss it and think about doing things to meet people where they are, even if you feel like you're above it in some ways. I mean, no, like I'm a saleswoman. I'm a saleswoman of human rights and democracy, and that's the way an attitude I should have, you know?